If you were to visit Greece today, you would be greeted with these words: Christos anesti, Christ is risen. Could you imagine the massive stone in front of the tomb was not enough to hold back the power of God. On that most wonderful Sunday morning, so many years ago, something happened that changed the world. And so we, like the whole world of believers, cry out, He is risen. Risen. Wow, that is unbelievable, isn't it? And yet, such wonderful news in the midst of a time of distressing news. But that's always the way it's been with the Resurrection Sunday. It comes amid gloom, disappointment, and discouragement to brighten not only our day, but our very eternity. And so, looking at the perspective of the world by the risen Jesus, we may well wonder how many things he'll want to do during the interval he has before his ascension. If we were designing his agenda or schedule, maybe we would have him go back to his enemies and parade himself before them, and maybe go to the Roman governor and show that he was alive. But God doesn't think like we do. And so sometimes the most important thing to do is to cheer up the discouraged ones and help them see the truths of the Bible. So we explore something that happened on Resurrection Sunday, and it's an amazing story told by the Dr. Luke. It's about a Sunday stroll by two of his disciples who were very, very downhearted and discouraged, and are on their way to a little town about 7 miles away from Jerusalem called Emmaus. Now, we don't know why they're going. It must have been something very important to take them away from Jerusalem and their friends who were also so discouraged. But that's kind of where the story starts. Luke tells us the name of one of these disciples, Cleopas, and the other one we don't know, but they knew who he was, and Jesus knew who he was. And what's important is we have two people here, and they're taking a Sunday walk to the town of Emmaus. Little did they know this would be the most important walk they had ever taken in their lives. And while a lot of us take trips that we enjoy and remember and watch the slides and remember all that we experience and maybe some of the negative things too, this journey, though, was a trip never to be forgotten. So Luke begins by telling us that we need to listen. Two of them in that very day were journeying to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were conversing with each other about all that had happened. And just then, a stranger appears. While they're questioning and talking, Jesus in person appears. And he began traveling with them. Now, Luke tells us their eyes were constrained, so they couldn't recognize him. A lot of people think that God did this so the whole scene could play out, but maybe their own discouragement and their own lack of faith at this time had about as much to do with their inability to see Jesus. And that's something to think about, isn't it? Sometimes that happens to us, maybe. So many things get in the way, and we get so preoccupied with our view of them that we might forget who's traveling with us all the way, Jesus. Now, there's something so unusual about this encounter. And you might think, well, Jesus has better things to do than to take a whole Sunday afternoon and spend with these two guys who are so downhearted. Well, maybe Jesus doesn't think like we do. So he says to them, do you mind if I join you? And I'm sure they stopped and looked at him and wondered who could this be and what was going on with him. But they held their peace until he spoke to them. So this stranger joins them and walks along with them, and then he asks them a question. What do these words mean that you are bouncing back and forth with each other as you are walking along? The Greek word here for the conversation is kind of like a word that means bouncing a ball back and forth. And it's really kind of an unusual word, but that's kind of the way they were talking, bouncing things off each other, all of them kind of negative. And they're kind of perplexed at this question and really do think this stranger is very, very uninformed. And they stood there in total misery, it says in the Greek text. One of them, named Cleopas, are you the only pilgrim visiting Jerusalem who does not know what has happened there in these days? And he said to them, what things? Can you believe this? It's like Jesus is playing a straight man, going along with the whole thing to see where these guys are going to take it, listening patiently and challenging them. This is really incredible. Two guys, downhearted, misery, walking down the road. The very Greek word is quite unusual for the state they were in. Skeuthmopoi. Skeuthmopoi means looking very miserable. Well, I want to tell you, if you've ever been downhearted, you know it can impact the way you look, the way you talk, the way you think. Your outlook of the world becomes very, very narrow for you. I suspect we've all been very discouraged at times, even though we ought to do better and know better, but yet that's our humanness, isn't it? And sometimes we don't realize what we really do know that might change that for us. Imagine Jesus saying, what things? What things? And they said, the events concerning Jesus the Nazarene, who was a man, a prophet, mighty in action and word in the presence of God and all the people. How our high priest and rulers handed him over to judgment that caused his death. They crucified him. They had so many hopes, and they all seemed dashed. But there actually was more going on than they would admit if they would just think for a moment or two. We were living in hope. He was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, with all that's happened, this is the third day that's passed. Yet, some of our women astounded us, since they came to the tomb at daybreak and they did not find his body. So they came away saying they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Sometimes we know more than we think we know. We just kind of conveniently forget the positive and dwell on the negative. And as they continue telling about the women who had more faith than any of them, it would seem, some of our companions headed to the tomb and found it was exactly as the women had said, but they did not see him. So, where do we go from here? Well, Jesus feels like they need to go back to the Bible. They need to go back to the Bible because there's the information that we need. The information to stir up our faith, to rehearse our faith, to show the meaning of our faith, give us not only the information but the inspiration we need. So that's what Jesus has right here on the road. He starts a Bible lesson with them. The gospel. He tells them the gospel story that they probably ought to know, but, it slips away sometimes. So, such poor thinkers, he said. You're not using your mind right. You're forgetting all your study. You're forgetting God's facts. So, you're not only not using your brain, but your heart isn't working right. Slow it is. So slow your heart is. The prophets said all these things, and you've heard them. Was it not necessary that the Messiah enter into his glory by suffering? Have you forgotten that story he's saying? Then beginning from Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them everything about himself in all the scriptures. And we won't go to the scripture to learn about Jesus and expect God to do all the work for us. Well, we're just like these two guys. We're not taking advantage of all the work God's already done to convince us of the reality of Jesus. He's going to be revealed, but there's something that happens first that's quite interesting. And I invite you to read this in Luke 24. They stop at an inn to retire for the night. It's getting late. They're tired. It's been a long walk. So they say, yeah, come on, spend the night here with us, because it looks like he's just going to go on walking. Jesus is really putting on quite a show here. It's interesting, isn't it? So they invite him in, and they sit down, and there's the breaking of the bread. And some people say, this kind of reminds me of the Lord's Supper, but this really couldn't be an official Lord's Supper, could it? Well, you make your own mind up about that. But the interesting thing is, he was revealed in the breaking of the bread exactly as he is revealed when we do communion. And in the breaking of the bread, we realize his body was broken. And in the taking of the fruit of the vine, we realize his blood was shed. He is revealed. Does this say something that if we would just learn to worship sincerely from our hearts and our spirit, that we would understand Jesus much more than we do now? Or do we just approach this as some artifact of the ages, some tradition that's been kept, but it doesn't mean all that much to us? Well, if it doesn't mean much to us, then it isn't going to mean much to us. But it means a great deal. And these people realized something about the breaking of the bread brought it all back. And in the breaking of the bread, he was revealed. So, in Scripture and in worship, the reality of the Lord is seen. The fact and reality of his resurrection is seen. The identity and presence of Jesus is affirmed. So is not this whole conversation about finding the real living Jesus? And it's done not only with his presence with us, but by Scripture and in worship as well. And when that becomes real in our lives, the resurrection becomes real in our lives. Now, after this is over, they're so excited they don't want to spend the night at the inn. Maybe they've already paid for it. So what? They scramble back to Jerusalem to tell the brothers and sisters about the risen Lord and how he'd appeared to them in the way. You said they can't go back at night. It's night, folks. That's 7 miles uphill. What's going to happen? You don't have a flashlight. I'm sure they got a hold of a torch or something. They were willing to make the journey now. And you know, this journey back was a whole lot more fun and a whole lot more exciting than the journey down there until they met Jesus. And when they thought about the whole thing later, this wonderful saying comes up. Did our hearts not burn within us as he talked to us on the way? Well, sum that one up, folks. That's what resurrection is, right? Jesus talking to you on your way of life. Maybe you don't recognize he's there, but by Scripture and worship and by faith, you will understand the power of the resurrection in your own life.